Hello, folks, and thank you as always for following the podcast. I really appreciate it. If you're having emotional struggles and you want someone to talk to, dial 988 right there, right there. There'll be people there happy to talk with you, help you with your struggles, and you'll have a better day. Yeah. This podcast is a conversation with Jacqueline, and Jacqueline has some amazing thoughts on change management. We're talking about it mostly from a business perspective, but all the things that she's talking about are also really valuable in a personal perspective also, whether it's changing in school, you're moving from middle school to high school to college, maybe even to a different school for grad school, or moving between your careers, or changes inside of a company, or even relationship changes. Fascinating work that she's done, grounded in lots and lots of research, very evidence-based. I'm really happy that I got a chance to sit down and talk with her. Hope you enjoy it. And of course, contact info for Jacqueline will be in the show notes. And if you happen to want to talk to either one of us, all of our contact info will be there. Hope you're having a great day. Thank you. Jacqueline, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you because from my perspective, a lot of the leadership world is all about change management. Mm-hmm. And helping people change and helping companies change, and companies are always changing. So definitely talking with you about your work, I think, is important for folks in the leadership world. The thing that I'm always curious about, and I want to get on the table right off the bat, from a 20,000 foot view philosophical perspective, what is the problem that you're solving with your system right now?
The perspective that I offer, the way that I look at the change process is different than we've historically looked at the change process. Mm-hmm. So rather than looking downstream and having to deal with all of the problems that come up during the change process, like resistance or, outright sabotage or people disengaging or, things that go wrong with the change process and trying to fix that because those are really expensive. My work goes upstream to create change capacity. So it doesn't matter what the change is or how sudden it is. People who understand their change fingerprint and use this framework to transition through change are always change ready, change resilient, and they can deal with the change. They have the control. They feel in control of the change process. So it doesn't matter what's happening. They can manage themselves through the change process. And that means that the whole process becomes easier, less costly, and less stressful for both the organization and the individual involved.
I like that. This is very much a people first approach.
Absolutely. Yeah, we always want to do change with people, never change to people, right?
Right. And anytime you're preemptively ahead of the situation, which is what I'm hearing,
yeah,
then it makes things much easier.
Absolutely. I mean, change is constant, right? There are only two things that we can count on in our life: change and death. Because not even taxes is valid, because there are 14 countries in the world that don't levy taxes. But change happens all the time on a daily basis, and we usually react to change. It's a very reactive experience. But by understanding your fingerprint, we develop that capacity, and it doesn't matter when the change happens or how many happen or whether we choose it or not. We always have the tools and the language and the concepts to be able to transition through it. So we're in control, right? It's a very empowering process to develop your fingerprint.
Right. Yeah, the individual control, I've noticed, seems to always be a thing that when you can get people to have more of that, they're way more relaxed, and their willingness to be vulnerable goes up, which
absolutely,
I get better work out of them that way. So yeah.
Well, and there's a physiological reason for that, right? And that's the basis of this work, is our physiological response, our brain's response to that loss of control, that loss of predictability. Because that, when our brain experiences a loss of predictability, and every change begins with loss, right? You have to lose your previous state, that has to disappear in order to adapt to the new state. So every change, whether it's positive or negative, chosen or imposed, sudden or planned, it begins with a loss.
Right,
And
right.
and this work really digs into how does our brain respond to that loss, and delineates between the physiological process and our character and our personality, because a lot of those responses we have stigmatized in the society, right? We don't, those responses are uncomfortable, they're emotional, they're often physical, they can be cognitive, and we've demonized those responses. There's something wrong with him, or there's something wrong with her. Oh, they can't deal with change, and and the power in this work is that it completely eliminates any stigma around your brain's response to change or what you need to transition through it. So all of a sudden, when the stigma around all of it is removed, it becomes much more accessible and much easier to do the work. And once you get everybody on board in the organization and understanding their fingerprint and doing the work, and everybody has the same shared language and tools and processes and mental models around us,
Mhm.
then suddenly change is really not easy, but a lot easier than it was,
Right, right.
right?
Um, you just said something that makes me curious. When you talk about mental models, can you share a couple of mental models? Because I'm always looking at mental models as the foundation for empowerment.
Right,
Our ability to do things is always predicated on having a model, a mental model of this is possible, and whatever it is can be done. Even if
right.
right now I don't know how. Right. So what are some of the mental models that you're
Well,
leveraging?
the foundation of this work is based on a mental model of courage, curiosity, and compassion, right? You
Mhm.
have to have courage, curiosity, and compassion before you can even start doing the work to develop your fingerprint. The reason you need courage is because this framework is extremely countercultural, and it demands of the individual that they unlearn what they've been socialized to believe about change, about how the body works, about who we are as human beings, about dealing with the barriers like gender socialization and toxic positivity that we've learned. So it
Mhm.
takes a lot of courage to go into that. We need curiosity to ask, why did my brain respond that way? Why am I responding this way
Right.
to a change? What does it mean? What can I learn? What do I need going forward into this change? So the ability to, and when you notice that someone else on your team is responding to change maybe differently than you are, the courage to ask those questions and the curiosity to really understand with compassion what they're experiencing with, and compassion versus empathy, because I would always argue for empathizing with someone's position, right? But I would say that, we don't want to have emotional empathy, because neurologically speaking, if someone is in crisis and we empathize with them emotionally, that activates our mirror neurons. And then suddenly, instead of one person in crisis, we have two people who can't think their way out of a paper bag. And that's just not really helpful. But if we sit with that person in compassion, and that means to hold space for them in a non-judgmental way and deeply listen to what they're experiencing, that activates the reward centers of our brain. And that's just healthy for both people. So that mental model of courage, curiosity, and compassion is absolutely a prerequisite to being able to do this work.
Nice. I like that. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, when you're, is this something that I always think about how do we systematize things, and what is the consistent, repeatable process so that we can scale, right? Um, do you, when you're teaching people this,
Mhm.
um, how do you bring this to an organization?
Well, I work with the leaders first, right? Because if the leaders don't understand their own fingerprint and they don't understand how change impacts the humans that work for them, it's not going to be very successful. So I work with the leaders first. How can you lead change if you don't understand how you yourself respond to change? A lot of leaders will say, oh, I'm great with change. And you know what? A lot of us are. A lot of leaders are. You might be good with this change, but not necessarily the next change. And
Right.
that's how you're programmed, right? That's entirely based on your experiences, your values, your education, your beliefs, and how your brain experiences that loss of predictability, control, or attachment. So once we work with the leaders, then we can work with the team leads.
Got it.
And ideally, we would and we would empower them to have the skills, knowledge, and attitudes to be able to work with their employees. So it's a longer process. It's not an overnight fix.
Right.
As a facilitator, as an educator, I don't believe in flying in, dropping a training, and then flying out. It's a longer process that includes education first, and then ongoing support through coaching, team coaching,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's not a quick fix, but it's definitely worth it because we're talking about cultural change, right? We're
Right.
talking about empowering the organization with a culture that is change ready, change resilient,
Right.
and that doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah. 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 And when you're changing, when you're looking at changing human behaviors, it's very hard to get an overnight big shift. It just is,
It is, and
especially
I
across
always
the board.
joke like, Bill, you're toilet trained, right?
Yes.
Generally, right?
Yeah.
Most of us
Yeah.
are generally, but that happened when you were very young and it didn't happen overnight, right?
Oh no, I
So
was a special child. It just only took a few seconds.
it took time for you to learn what that uncomfortable feeling was in your lower abdomen and what you needed to do about it and the urgency with which you needed to do that. And eventually you learned the relationship between drinking liquid and then that uncomfortable feeling and what you needed to do. It's a
Right.
physiological process that our bodies have to, need in order to operate optimally, right? And when our brain experiences change, it triggers the adaptive response. And that triggers a process that we need to support. Just like we need to be toilet trained, we also need to learn how our brains are change trained, can be change trained. And that doesn't happen overnight.
When is is this a is this a process that is horizontally scalable? Like,
Yes.
okay, yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it's not that leaders need to understand everybody's fingerprint. It's that leaders need to understand that everybody has one, right? Just like, I don't know, just like leaders don't need to understand everybody's dietary preference, they need to understand that everybody needs to eat.
right,
So when you talk about scaling this, you just take a group at a time and run them through, right?
right, right.
And depending on how it's delivered, whether I deliver in person or whether I deliver electronically, like virtually through e-learning,
Mhm.
this is a process that can be done whether it's with 10 people or 1,000 people, same process. But the benefit would be making sure that everybody shares that language
Right,
and the
right,
tools and the concepts and the mindset. Because
right,
otherwise, you've got one team operating very differently in an organization that still is operating under very different assumptions around change and
right.
how we respond to it.
Um, can are the philosophical perspectives in this and the skills, can you take them outside of the work context? Like, for example, a family gets moved, uh, the company relocates them, right? They're like, oh, right now you're in London, and we're going to move you to the other side of the country, or the other side of the world for that matter. Um, Same kind of approach, or
Absolutely. Your brain, you don't have a different brain at home than you do at work, right? You don't
right,
have a different bladder at home than you do at work, right? This is a human physiological process that we have neglected to recognize in the general population, right? Clinicians will know this, right? They understand how people change and how people respond to change and how they grieve, but we don't teach our kids this. And really, when you consider that, moving from London to Paris brings an astronomical number of changes with it, right?
right,
Changes in orientation or loss of orientation, loss of language, loss of family, perhaps. Um, our brains are going to think that we're going to be eaten. And if and therefore will trigger that adaptive response. If we understand the signals that our adaptive response has been triggered by our brain, then we can recognize them, go, oh, wait a sec, I know what's happening. I feel really uncomfortable physically, or I can't think my way out of a paper bag right now. Something, my brain has detected a threat. Then we can stop and go, oh, wait, what's happened? What has been lost? What's changed? I now know my barriers. I know what tools I need to use to transition through it. I know what partners I can speak to make sure that I've got the support, and off I go. It's like toilet training. You don't relearn it, right?
Yeah.
Once you know this once, you can deal with the change at hand and any change in your future. That's why I think it's so important that we teach this to young people, at grade, age 12, age 18, at the moment of any big transition, so that eventually we'll have a whole population that is change trained. And that means for our population, then we'll see lower numbers of anxiety, depression, addiction, antisocial behaviors, and worse. So, because the stress caused by not knowing how to do this
Right.
it makes us sick and sad and addicted and worse.
When you're talking about kids and family,
Mhm.
um, uh, from the mental health work that we've done, I know that it's really tough on kids frequently when they're going off to college.
Yes.
We've been talking about professionally, but it's my podcast. I can talk about family on it. Um, is there a version of this that is helping, that's like focused on helping high school students transition to college, or
Yes,
whatever they're doing?
actually.
Yeah.
When I started doing this work, my daughter Maya was in her last year of school and preparing to go off to university, about 8 hours from where we live. And she was really excited about the change, but she and her friends were really nervous about everything that was going to be happening and changing and moving away from home and going to big city and starting school and losing friends. And so I thought, well, let me rework this. And I taught her the concepts. And in doing so, when she felt more comfortable, and she was teaching her friends actually, which was really interesting,
Nice.
I thought, okay, I've never developed an e-learning course before. Let me figure out how to do that. And I developed a course for high school graduates on transitioning out of high school. So we're just finishing that up now. And hopefully that will be a start, because the vision is to get high school grads first year post-secondary, because I think 65% of post-secondary students are already reporting extreme levels of anxiety and depression by November of their first year.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
that's hard on the kids, but for post-secondary institutions, the attrition for first-year students is very costly as well.
Right.
So
Right.
let's get this from both ends.
Yeah. Um, the the reasons for dropping out of college, um, that all the data that I've seen, almost all the reasons are stress related,
Yeah,
some way, shape, or
exactly.
form. They're all very solvable problems.
Hmm.
You look at it, you're like, well, that's solvable.
Hmm.
Looking at it as an adult, right? That's
Hmm.
already gone through a lot of change and all that stuff. I can look at that and go, this is a very solvable problem, but clearly the students don't know. They don't know how to see it as a solvable problem. Number one,
Or they
right?
don't have the capacity,
Right.
because when our brain experiences that loss of predictability, control, or attachment, and those are the big three intangible losses that will trigger the adaptive response, it moves the primary functioning to the amygdala, right?
Right.
So
Right.
out of the frontal lobe, which is responsible for decision making, problem solving, being creative, and all those things you need to navigate your way through any change, whether at work
Right.
or whether
Right.
you're going off to school.
Right.
And it all it says is, be safe. There's a tiger behind that tree and it's going to eat you. And we're going to
Yeah.
shut down all your ability to think creatively and just make sure you don't die. Now,
Right.
we know we don't live with that level of threat, right? That changes are unlikely to create that level of threat for us. But our brains don't know that, because they're really old organs that you really can't do a systems upgrade on unless you do a manual override. And that manual override means learning what your brain does on
Right.
change. learning
Right.
what you need to transition through it.
Right.
And the problem with that is that everybody needs different things, right?
Right.
Everybody will
Right.
respond to change differently and needs different things to transition through it, and will take different lengths of time to transition through it. And one of the biggest problems that we have is expecting people to respond the same way we do. So if
Yep.
we're okay with the change, how come you're not okay with it?
Yeah.
And then we judge and we
Right.
blame and we guilt and we shame. And that just adds an extra layer of stress onto the whole thing. And it makes it doubly as hard, a double whammy.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, okay. So this is really interesting. Huh. So uh, we don't know each other well enough for you to know this, but I grew up in a military household where we moved
Okay.
every other year.
Yeah.
So lots of change.
Yep.
I lived in 7 places by the time I was 14. And they were
I
typically
understand the
like,
lifestyle.
right. They were typically like across the planet, it was like
Right.
thousands of miles. It wasn't like, we weren't moving to the next town over. And so for me, the change process is automated. Like
You
it's
learned.
yeah, I learned. And also as you're talking about the negative consequences of people being uncomfortable with change, I realized that the environment I was in, everybody else around me was in, and everybody was okay with the change, and everybody had automated processes
Yeah. Uh,
to
That, that
yeah, it's
change
like
had become predictable,
yeah,
right? Every
exactly.
three years,
More
you move to a
predictable.
different
Exactly.
base. So
Yeah.
your brain isn't losing predictability,
Right,
even
right.
though you're moving from Fort Worth to Kaiserslautern in Germany,
Yeah,
right? Your brain is going, oh, I know what to do here. This is predictable.
right,
It's when
exactly.
that predictability is lost
Yeah,
that
yeah.
your brain goes, oh my gosh, I think we're going to be eaten.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. That's interesting. I never really considered, like the side benefits of my childhood like that before. In that way, that
Right,
it had that predictability, um, because most people wouldn't see that as predictable,
right.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
you take some. So my son is 18 and plays for our local semi-pro team, soccer team, FC London. And when he learned about this stuff, he said, Mom, you've really got to do something with professional athletes. Because when you take a soccer player from Madrid and you put them in Manchester, all of a sudden that amazing soccer player in Madrid becomes useless in Manchester. Why? I said, well, he's losing his language, his orientation, his teammates, his coach, so his secure base. And there are myriad other intangible losses. And
mhm.
that's just really expensive,
Right,
right?
right,
But when that player has been sold a number of times, he's going to be okay. And I'm
right.
using he as a gender. Women are coming up in soccer, and Canadian women are really great. Go Canada. But yes, when you asked about, is this applicable in any other context? Absolutely. Can you imagine someone who's been institutionalized in the military? They've been in service for 20 years and they retire and they go back to civilian life. Let's say they've done 4 or 5 tours and they've reached an officer rank, and all of a sudden they go into civilian life and they're nobody. They're Mr.
Mhm.
Smith again instead of Major Smith, and they don't have any reports and they don't have a mandate, and that's extremely disorienting. No wonder we see so many mental health issues among retirees, right?
Right.
And vets.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
any context, whether you're retiring, whether you're in professional sports, whether you're going to school, whether you're going through a merger, or you're experiencing, you've just been handed a promotion at work and you've gone from an individual contributor to now leading the team that you used to be part of.
Right, right.
You know, if we have the capacity, if we understand how our brains respond to change, and we know what our unique change fingerprint is, then it doesn't change the change and it doesn't make it any less uncomfortable. But it does help us get through it more quickly, more efficiently, with less stress and less cost.
You've mentioned changed fingerprints a few times,
Yes,
so that makes me curious. Are there is there a finite set of fingerprint patterns, or is it like human beings where you and I don't have the same fingerprints? Is it like,
exactly.
in my mental model is like, is it like blood types where there's a finite set of blood types, or is it like fingerprints where there's as many different ones as there are people?
So I coined the term change fingerprint when, after doing research in this for a number of years, and I realized that everybody responds to change. Well, change will affect everyone differently. Everyone responds to change differently. Everyone has different signals, has different barriers that prevent them from processing and adapting efficiently and healthily and quickly. We have different things that we need to help us transition. We have different people in our lives that we can lean on. We will have different things, different experiences of loss, different experiences of the gains around the change. There's 6 variables in a fingerprint. So essentially 1,000 people could go through the exact same change, and each one will respond differently and need different things to transition through it and take different lengths of time to transition and adapt. And that is a really countercultural concept, because when Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed her model of grief, the 5 stages of grief, she never meant it to be used outside of, to describe a few people's experience of a terminal diagnosis, right?
Okay.
That's how she meant it to be used. But it was quickly, because it was the first time anyone ever talked about grief, and grieving is a synonym for transitioning through change. It was co-opted to be the model for how humans grieve. And then change practitioners took it and used it as the model for how humans change in the workplace. Except those 5 stages, it's not valid. And Kubler-Ross herself said years ago that it shouldn't be used. And it was debunked years ago in the grief space. In lieu of other more accurate models of how humans transition and adapt. But it's really easy. So when we expect people to go through 5 stages on a somewhat predictable schedule, right, and need these things, we can avoid the yucky stuff at the beginning by trying to design for the end and pushing the benefits of the change more frequently and more loudly and more clearly. But it's really hard to push people toward a change when their brains are still experiencing loss and are in that adaptive state, when their amygdalas are triggered, right? They simply can't consider the benefits when they're still thinking about the losses. And I had, so using the 5 stages of grief is not helpful because it causes unreasonable expectations, unrealistic expectations, pardon me, and it causes a double whammy because now people are afraid to say what they're experiencing because they're not adapting at the same rate that others are, or they're experiencing a loss when no one else is, and that's very isolating.
Right,
And that
right.
just adds that extra layer of stress, which makes it thus the more difficult to adapt.
Interesting. Uh, you, it would be awesome if you had a program that was focused on military vets.
I would love to have a program that was focused on military vets.
Yeah.
I would love to have someone from that space
Yeah.
help me to develop it. So if there's anyone out there in a senior position who has transitioned through or transitioned out of the military and who would like to help me get the words and the concepts right, the concepts never change, but the context changes.
Right,
And I
right.
need to position this very carefully because I never position this as a mental health program, ever. I'm not a clinician. I'm not a
Sure.
psychologist. Um, this is to create change capacity.
Right,
So to
right.
help vets transition out of the military back into civilian life in a really healthy,
Yeah,
efficient, effective manner for them and their families, right?
yeah.
Because
I'm gonna
nobody
send you
transitions
some.
in a vacuum.
Yeah, I will introduce you to some people that I know that
I
are
would love that.
vets. Yeah.
I had one ex major from the Marines take a look at this. He's now the head of he's now involved in learning and development for one of the big 4 companies, consulting companies in New York, and he loudly endorsed this,
Oh, good,
which was helpful.
good.
And then I've also showed it to someone from the Special Forces, Special Air Service, or SAS in the UK, who has also been very supportive of it and has encouraged me
Nice.
to
Yeah.
work with vets.
Yeah. So yeah, I know a few people that are vets who are working in the space of helping vets transition out of the military into civilian life.
It's
And that, yeah,
it, it's a special passion of mine, although I do work in the organization, like organizational change is my wheelhouse,
mhm,
right? But I know I I was personally affected by suicide in that space, and I would very much like to see the suicide rates among first responders and military decrease drastically. And if this can help in any way,
yeah,
then let's do that. Hey.
yeah, definitely, definitely, yeah. Um, is there a version of this for, like what's the bottom threshold? Like, I'm thinking about, the experiences of my kids as they grew up, and the the challenge going from kindergarten to first grade.
I love that you asked that question because I had a conversation with someone a few years ago who works in children's mental health
Mhm.
and asked her about how grieving is handled in that space. And I watched a video that they had produced where the child loses their first grade teacher. She goes off on, or they go off on leave, so that they're getting a new teacher. And the child is upset, and the adults say, "Oh, don't worry," invalidating the emotional response
Right, right,
already. Look
yeah,
at all the good things that the new teacher will bring. So let's not talk about your experience of loss. Let's just focus on all the good stuff. That
right,
is toxic positivity is at its best because you're teaching the child to ignore their own emotional responses,
right,
right?
right,
And every human being was gifted with a full spectrum of emotions, right? And each one of those has an evolutionary purpose, right? To
right,
keep us safe, alive, and part of a social group. But we in this society have chosen to demonize half of them and to shame, guilt, fear, and judge half of them because they're negative, but they're necessary. And when we
right,
suppress them, when we teach our children to suppress their emotional responses, they grow up to eventually be drinking a bottle of Jack every day, for example, right?
right,
I think that it hasn't been created yet, but I've been playing with stories that can help parents and their very young children deal with loss in a really healthy, fun way. So we teach kids, right from the get-go, it's okay to be sad about something. It's okay to name what you're sad about, what you're losing. Let's honor that. Let's create
right,
some rituals around the state that's being lost
right,
so that we can put it to bed, right?
yeah,
And then transition through, figure out what you specifically need to feel good to get your brain from amygdala hijack back into the frontal lobe so
hmm,
that you're thinking creatively and you can solve those problems. And then let's look at how great that new teacher is going to be,
right,
right?
right.
So it's
I like that. Yeah. Um, is there a version of this for people that are getting divorced?
not yet, but again, that was the origin story for me.
Ah, okay. Well, then great.
That's where the work came from.
Okay. So
Because
quick aside, what is
yeah.
the origin story?
Oh, well, 5 years ago, I went through a situation that really the dissolution of my marriage changed everything for me personally and professionally. And it was a hugely positive development. Let me say this was good for everybody.
Hmm.
But a year afterward, I was mystified because I wasn't living in sunshine and daisies, So it was I was actually still struggling to adapt. And I got really curious because I thought, well, this makes no sense to me because I should be doing cartwheels, right? And I'm not. So what's happening here? And I got really curious about loss and how we respond to loss.
Hmm.
And I took a course with Dr. Darcy Harris, who specialized in non-death loss and grief and change. And that course gave me the concept of intangible loss, something that we don't talk about in our society. The tangible loss is my husband and I split, he left the
Yep.
house. That's an intangible loss
Right,
or a
right,
tangible loss. But the intangible losses included loss of 23 years of my life, loss of time, loss of potential, loss of career, loss of my dream of how, the nuclear family and
yeah,
all of that. So it was those things that were bothering me. And once I named them,
Mhm.
And I had them validated. Like somebody said to me, yep, that sucks.
Yeah, yeah.
My identity was the biggest loss, actually. I didn't know who I was. I was always so-and-so's wife and
Mhm.
their mother. And suddenly I wasn't that anymore. I was married. Now I wasn't. I was single. So being a researcher and already involved in change management, I started looking at how does the brain respond to change? And what happens to us? And I took this interdisciplinary research tour through thanatology, which is the study of death, and ethology, which is the study of humans as animals, and evolutionary psychology and developmental psychology and organizational psychology and physiology and leadership studies and change management theory, and threw it together with a whole bunch of common sense. And I went, wait a second, I think as a society we have overlooked something here, and that's the fundamental need for the human being to acknowledge loss and process loss,
Mhm.
which we don't
Mhm.
want to talk about because it's really negative, right? But it's
Right.
not. I'll get
Right.
to that in a second. Before we start pushing toward the positive, let's
Right.
overlook the uncomfortable and the stuff that we don't want to talk about and focus on the positive. Well, the more we push toward positivity and the more that we suppress and demonize that very human experience of the darkness that happens with change, the sicker we become and the unhealthier we become. And that has been proven over and over again by researchers like Dr. Bessel von Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps Score, and Dr. Gabor Mate, who wrote When the Body Says No, and myriad others who talk
Mhm.
about the impact of emotional suppression on our health.
Right. That's awesome. Um, okay, that completely makes sense. I always like a good origin story. Thank you.
Well, once I figured that out, I started thinking about how does this work in the workplace? And I realized that as change practitioners, we too are focused on pushing people toward the positive of a change,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And leaders want people to overlook the negative. I had a change practitioner say to me, well, this stuff about loss, it's so negative. And I pointed out to her, I said, just because it's a loss doesn't mean it's a negative, and just because it's a gain doesn't mean it's a positive, right?
True. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um, and and it comes down to what do you want for your people, right? If you're
Mhm.
constantly pushing toward the positive and overlooking the losses, note that I didn't say the negatives, but the losses
Sure.
and the human impact of those losses or the physiological impact of those losses, you're really making it a lot harder for yourself in a change context, right?
Right, right,
Because
right.
it's like dragging people through when they're not ready.
Yeah,
And whereas if we stopped looking downstream to fix the negative impact or the negative consequences of change gone wrong and went upstream to create change capacity in each individual that works for us, things would go a lot easier and just be a lot cheaper.
right, right. So I'm thinking, just because my world's been leading teams,
Mhm.
how do is there again, I think about how do I get out ahead of the problem, right? Because it's kind of like the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure kind of model. Like
Yeah,
really, I really want to be as early to course correct something that could turn into a problem.
right,
Um, is there a and like and also I live in the tech world, and the tech world is always changing. There's always
right,
something happening that's like okay, so right now people are talking about AI, right? As it's going to change and everything's going to be different. There's a lot of people that are are talking about it in a context of, oh my god, I'm going to lose my job, so I'm going to get replaced by a robot. And the funny thing is, when we were talking about offshoring software development 20 years ago, everybody was freaking out that they were going to get replaced by a software engineer who didn't sit at the next cube. They had the same
right.
fear. How do we bring this kind of thing in so that the normal business evolution that's always here, at least in the tech world, isn't scary for people anymore, or it's
Well,
manageable, right? Even if it is scary, it's still manageable.
Well, we are in the age of AI now, aren't we?
Oh, we are. Yeah.
We're right smack dab in the middle.
Yeah.
And I think because we're right in the, we're playing with AI, we're living it right now, it's more important than ever to understand what it means to be human, right?
Mhm.
And to your point, we can be freaking out about AI. That's a huge change. And I come back to the point of if you understand how you yourself respond to change, right? And what you need to transition through it, you're not going to experience, you're going to be able to manage anything, right? You're going to be able to preserve your ability to think creatively and problem solve and, you know, make decisions so that even if you lose your job, let's say, because of AI, it may be uncomfortable for a short period of time, but definitely not for an extended period of time because you have capacity to figure out what's next, right? So from a performance perspective, this knowing this stuff and understanding how we respond to change and understanding your fingerprint means that your performance doesn't suffer to the extent that it would if you didn't understand this stuff.
Right.
Because change happens all the time. It will continue to happen. Where I think there's a book, Managing at the Speed of Change, that talks about how change is accelerating.
Yep.
And
Yep.
coming back to the toilet training example,
Mhm.
right? We, if you were out with a buddy and you were having a couple of drinks, would you judge them if they had to go to the washroom?
No.
No, because this is a physiological process that we all
Right.
have. We all need it. We all do it. It's not a big deal, right?
Right. Right.
But what we're essentially doing is asking people to change and keep changing without ever allowing them to process. So that's the same as drink and keep drinking, but don't ever pee.
Yeah, that would be very, very uncomfortable.
Very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And if we allowed people the space and the time to honor their humanity from a physiological perspective when it comes to change, then things would go a lot easier. There'd be a lot less fear.
Yep.
There'd be a lot less costs associated with it
Right.
because
Right.
turnover, absenteeism, presenteeism, outright sabotage would be those things that cost so much. We'd see a decrease in those because people are like, yep, it's changing. Okay, bring it on. Don't know what it is, but I
Right.
know how I'm going to deal with it because I
Yep.
know how to deal with myself.
Right. Right. Yeah. And having that as a, from a leadership perspective, having that as part of my skill set so that I can bring that to my team and everybody in the team can be relaxed because we're changing whatever, we're
Yep,
re-architecting our product. Been
yep,
there, done that, had people be like, whoa, I don't know this new thing,
yeah.
and also, I had people on the team that they were super excited because they saw the opportunity of the change. They
Mhm,
were very, very high on the this is an awesome adventure kind of mental framework.
mhm,
Um, and and there were other people that were not.
mhm,
The excited people kind of carried the people that were scared until the ones that were scared and and just the fear didn't last for very long. It was like a couple of weeks of fear of I'm not going to be able to learn this new programming language, which is kind of silly, especially when you're working with people that already know like 5 languages. Adding language number 6 is not that big a deal, but that's a not everybody has that gut feeling that they can add another language easily, right? So they're afraid.
So what if there was less fear? What if there
Right.
was fear for a shorter period of time?
Yeah, that would have
What
been awesome.
if there was no judgment around how other people are responding? And
Right.
instead of having judgment, right? And like, what's
Yeah.
wrong with Joe in accounting? He's usually so good with change, but now he's afraid to learn a new language. What's wrong with him?
Right. Right.
Therefore isolating Joe and judging Joe. And,
Yeah.
that's not cool. What if the question was, noticing that Joe was having a response and then sitting down with him and saying, so what'd you lose?
Right, right. That's an awesome question. Yeah,
And then having Joe be able to speak to that, like, well, I'm losing competence
right,
because now we're moving to this new language and I'm really good with these languages, but I don't know that one. And for whatever reason, I feel like I'm losing competence. I'm losing confidence. That's affecting my self-esteem and having the leader say, okay, I hear that. Regardless of what the leader thinks about it, right? It's not the leader's
sure.
job to have a judgment around what Joe is experiencing. It's
Right,
the
right,
leader's job to understand that Joe is experiencing something and to sit there with space and time and compassion to let Joe say, I feel like I'm losing competence and confidence.
right, right.
Okay,
Totally
that
makes sense.
lets, when we acknowledge that, that allows Joe's brain to move from amygdala hijack back into the frontal lobe where he can start thinking like, oh, wait a second, I already learned 5 languages. Here's another one. What do I need to do? What have I learned from learning those, the process of learning those 5 languages that I could apply to this one, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And all of a sudden you've taken a bulldozer to all the crap that is usually piled on to the experience of change, shoved it out of the way so that your brain can actually think clearly and get through that and learn that language.
that's awesome. And I'm using language as metaphor for anything, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's you're changing third party vendors that do your hosting, and so
Yeah,
you're moving from AWS to Azure, or if there's something changing in a business model, or you're changing a payment processor, and so you got to there's a
absolutely
bazillion things that
anything,
we can
anything.
change.
I Can I just point out that the people that are great with that implementation of learning the new language or learning the new system, they seem to be great. I would challenge you to throw them into a situation where all of a sudden they're having a baby and maybe they're
Oh
not
yeah,
so good with change.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It really is unique to the individual's experience. That's why it's a fingerprint.
right,
I'm
right,
great with these changes, but throw that change at me, and all of a sudden my brain is off on its own, off, into adaptive process land.
right, right. And having a system you can abstract into multiple contexts makes that
It helps.
yeah, tech is easy, but having a baby is going to be hard.
Yeah. So the question is, you teach this process then teaches people what they can use from the one context and apply it to the other context,
Right,
right?
right,
So it's not that you're just toilet trained at work. Now you're toilet
right,
trained
right,
at
right,
work
right,
and at home.
right, right.
I have
Yeah,
to stop using that because people think that I'm teaching toilet training, but I'm
right, 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 right. No, but
not.
it is a really good standard abstracted process that we do in multiple contexts, right? It's not just at home. It's your kid, you're going to school, they all have bathrooms, right? So it makes sense,
Yeah,
right?
it really makes so much sense because in organizations, when you look at it, every organization that I've ever worked in has had a bathroom. I've had set work hours, which means that I have set rest hours, right? I've got weekends, I've got time to rest, I've got time to eat, I've
Yep,
got the facilities and time to use the washroom if I need to. These are all physiological processes that humans require, human bodies require in order
exactly.
to operate
Yep, yep,
effectively. And yet we're not allowing space or time for our brains to respond to and adapt to change,
right, right.
right? Usually it's
Yeah,
get on board or get out.
yeah, yeah.
So you get people who look like they're on board
Yeah,
and then eventually quit.
right. Okay, total confirmation bias, and I will acknowledge that. Um and it maybe and I'm there's got to be like, I'm thinking like environmental standardization, because like most of my experience has been in startups or very
Okay.
early stage companies, you know, they were not 5,000 plus, 10,000 plus employee companies, right?
Mhm.
And so there there's a perceivable difference in volatility
Yes,
between
absolutely.
those things, right? I
Yeah.
had a much different experience with with volatility at Google, where almost zero volatility, versus, you know, the startup where I'm the first employee who's not a chief something or other,
Right.
right? Radically different environments, radically different velocities. Um, I took for granted, and I take for granted, the volatility of the smaller organization,
Okay.
because I've the first company I worked at was a startup, right? So that was normal for me. Like, and frankly, it was really hard to go to Google because what I lost in going to Google was the ability to see changes happening as we were getting smarter.
Okay.
Right? Because now you've got the inertia of getting all this, and so, you know, my team sees something and we're like, oh, we should do this thing, right? This is the smarter thing to do, right? We learned something, we should move. But there's all the inertia of all these people that need to say yes before we can make a change,
Right.
right?
So
Whereas
you
at the
lost
startup,
nimbleness.
yeah, at the startup, I only have to go convince one person,
Right.
and that person may actually just be me, right?
Right.
You know, I may be the one that gets to go, okay, yeah, we're doing this. Um, and for me, it was super uncomfortable to go to this environment where all of it, like, I lost all the power.
So you lost control,
I
you
lost
lost power,
control.
you
Right,
lost
right.
authority, you probably lost status, you lost respect.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
those are big changes.
yeah. And I was like, this is really frustrating. We
Mm-hmm.
know what the smart thing is to do here,
Mm-hmm.
but I've got, you know, more people to convince than I have a team
Mm-hmm.
before I can get the yes that I need to get this out the door.
So how long did you last at Google?
Less than a year.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah. And that, um, yeah, I didn't have the patience to wait for that stack.
No.
Um,
And I want to bet that you were a pretty expensive employee to lose because they would have had to spend double your salary to replace
oh,
you.
yeah,
And if you were well liked, I would venture to guess that probably a few people left shortly after you left. And that then becomes extremely expensive.
yeah,
But as a leader, first of all, you don't want to have to spend that kind of money, right?
right, right,
Um, as a leader, if you have the language, tools, concepts, and mindset where you can sit down with someone and say, Bill, what'd you lose? And you have the ability to say, well, I lost this, this, and this, that then starts a conversation, right?
right, right,
What does Bill need? How do we make this better? Because Bill is a huge asset and can contribute to changing our organization and making and enhancing its performance. We don't want to lose Bill because Bill feels like he doesn't have the ability to get something done,
right,
right?
right. Yeah,
Valuable conversations that save millions of dollars.
right. Yeah, yeah. And it's funny, Google has a very high attrition rate of people who leave in 13 months or less. I'm not the only one.
Hmm.
And I think that's um, I think people get in expecting it to move, things to move faster.
It
Uh,
would be interesting if Google were to adopt this and see what their attrition rate becomes,
yeah, right,
2 years after adoption.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I think realistically, any I think every company should get comfortable with, like, on an individual basis, with this, the whole idea of normalizing and understanding how to operate in a volatile environment,
Mhm.
and not being afraid of it. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, well, a great place to start is making sure that every single employee in your company understands what their fingerprint is, what their
Right,
change fingerprint is,
right,
and is able to has the psychological safety to have those conversations when necessary. So that when you have every single person in that organization change enabled, all of a sudden you have a change enabled culture,
right,
right?
right, right,
And changes happen more quickly.
right,
And from an organizational perspective, you see that you have less turnover, less absenteeism. Changes are implemented more quickly. Your engagement is higher.
Right.
your reputation as an employer goes up,
Yep.
like all these benefits.
Yeah.
And it comes down to the N1 approach of teaching everybody what their like having everyone develop their fingerprint and then having that be okay,
Right. Right.
right?
Yeah.
Even if 100 people are going through the same change and only one person seems to not be on board, right?
Hmm.
To have that be the beginning of a conversation of, Bill, what'd you lose?
Right. Right.
Because that's the benefit on an individual level. When you know this, you're healthier, happier, less stressed,
Right.
right? Your
Right.
performance is enhanced, right? Your relationships are enhanced, your health is, you're healthier physically, emotionally. But on a team level, it helps to identify opportunities and gaps. It starts conversations, it enhances psychological safety, right? And therefore increases or enhances the performance of the team. And then you can, on
Yeah.
an organizational level, all of a sudden you've got a competitive advantage vis-a-vis your other people in your space or other organizations in your space, because you're actually honoring the human physiological need to process and adapt to change.
Right. Right. Yeah. That totally makes sense. Yeah. I like that. That's awesome. It's funny because I'm, I'm now I'm having like, okay, what are the, what are the, all the different ways that people don't recognize, or they like I autopilot, like I don't know what the process is, but for me change is fun,
Okay.
except except when I can't make change happen, right? For me, when I can't make change
Right.
happen, it's super frustrating, right? Because I know where I want to go and I want to go there.
Well, that seems to be a loss of power
Loss
or
of,
loss
yeah,
of
power and
capacity.
control. Yeah, it's like, why is there a roadblock here? This is so annoying. You know?
So are you asking how does it show up? Like how does it,
No,
how
no,
does
just
your, like what are the signals that your brain gives you when it's experiencing a loss of control or power?
I know that I get frustrated when I'm like, wait a minute, I've got 27 people I have to convince.
Yeah,
That's crazy. You know, um, we're like every minute that we're waiting is probably $100,000 we lost,
right,
and maybe it's more than that. I don't know how to do them. I'm like, it's going to rack up some serious dollars,
right.
and I'm sure I'm not the only person that's run into that situation. I can't be. And so, the opposite side is, how do you get the rest of the org chart to understand that their change aversion is actually costing them a ton of money, because they're making somebody with a good idea run through
It
all
does.
these hoops, right?
Yeah,
And here's the, like, here's the math. You guys just burned up, and yeah, Google makes a lot of money, whatever big company it is, but that somehow that inflexibility, number one, people are leaving because they're frustrated, but number two, how much money are you burning up because you can't get out of your own way?
it sounds like you're asking how do you actually implement change processes in the organization in a really effective way.
Yeah, maybe that's the question. Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
That moves on to other other models.
Right. Right.
So with my company, Capillary Consulting, we also have capillary learning, and we actually teach the nuts and bolts of organizational change. So how do you actually implement a change? How do you get people on board? How do you, what's the most effective way of doing that?
Right.
And we start with the certified change agent workshop, which teaches people the nuts and bolts of the process of implementing a change in the workplace, whether it's a policy change or a product change or person change. What I hear you saying is, I got this great idea and I'd like to implement it, and I can't get anybody to listen, or I can't get the higher ups to listen. I would be tempted to go to John Cotter's model for change, where you get somebody with a voice
Right. Right. Right.
to, you
Yeah.
convince somebody with a voice and then
Yeah.
let them take it to the next level and make sure that everybody knows the urgency of this change and what it is and what the benefits are. And then you go through an 8-step model or,
Right.
whatever. That's Cotter's model, but there are hundreds of models of
Yeah.
change,
Yeah.
right? And then the Association for Change Management Professionals has a framework for change implementation, and any change practitioner would be following that model. So I'm happy to teach you that, not
Cool.
today.
Yeah. No, no, that's good. Well, and it's part of it is also, my own not knowing what somebody else's priorities are,
Yeah.
right? Because, so I'm thinking it's $100,000 a minute. They're looking at something else that they want to implement that's $250,000 a minute,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they're like, and I don't know this yet, right? For me, it's a blind spot, and so that's one of those internal transparency
Mm-hmm.
kind of things,
Well, I know in
And we're
conversations
going down a
about
rabbit hole here. I'm totally
that's
rabbit
okay.
holing. It's
In
like,
conversations about
yeah,
change, we often, because our brain is behaves differently on
sure,
change than it does in status quo, right?
right.
And one of my mentors, Dr. Barbara Troutbean, has written a book called CQ Leadership or CQ Intelligence about change intelligence, and her model of 7 types, um, typologies of what our preferences are, what our behavioral preferences are
Hmm.
when our brains experience change is really, really helpful. Because often we create our own barriers, right?
Right,
When
right,
we're trying to
exactly.
communicate change, our own preferences might be diametrically opposed to the preferences of the person that you're trying to influence. And that
Right,
means that you've got a translation issue, right? They can't hear you because something that you're saying or doing is actually getting in the way of how they need things to be said,
right,
or
right.
what needs to be highlighted. So yeah, for communicating change or working in a team that's been charged with a change, I
Mhm.
would absolutely send you to Barbara Troutlean's work
Okay,
100% of the time.
cool, awesome. I'm paying attention to the time and going, okay, we've been doing this for a bit. We've hit
Yeah.
kind of my mental limit for, and plus you've got the rest of the day. Um, I'm going to put your contact info in the show notes so anybody who wants to get hold of you can do that easily. Um,
Yeah,
my
that'd be great.
Yeah, my
Happy to work with
suggestion.
people. Sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
my suggestion is if you're in any context where change is happening. So far we've talked about transitioning vets, um, uh,
Organizational change.
organizational change, of
That's
course,
my
right?
wheelhouse.
That's the wheelhouse. But vets. I would say arguably if you got kids that are changing schools, as they're moving up, or they're teachers are changing or whatever, they're going off to college. That's a
Mm.
huge one around here. There's a high stress level around here for that, um, or possibly even looking at doing career changes. You know,
Yep.
somebody
Or
who's
I think divorce was thrown in there as
divorce
well.
was thrown in there. Yeah, of
I
course. Yeah,
think
divorce is a
babies were
huge
thrown in
one.
there. I mean,
Babies, yeah.
when you look at the life events that are listed on the Holmes Raw Stress Inventory, which is an inventory of the top stressors in an adult's life, there's 43
Mhm.
items. Each one of those is a change,
Right. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Every single one. And it's
Yeah.
like being deployed, starting a new job, experiencing a change in your finances, whether positive or negative. You'd be surprised at the losses that lottery winners experience,
Right. Right.
Yeah, this work is relevant to any context where change occurs. My wheelhouse happens to be organizational change because
Right.
that's where I grew up in. I have a graduate degree in organizational development and I worked in OD
Nice.
for a long time. But the work remains the work, whether
Yeah.
you're 6 or 12 or 18 or 58,
Right.
it doesn't
Beautiful.
matter.
Thank you. That's awesome. This has been super cool. I love it.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah,
Yeah, and
this
I'm
is fun.
I'm and I'm thinking we might need to do like another episode in the future.
Okay.
I'm not sure what it will look like yet, but there's like us bubbling in the back of my head that I need to let process for a while before I go, oh, it's this. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to have the opportunity to sit down with some vets and work with
Yeah.
them
Yeah.
on
Yep.
this, but and see how that shakes out,
Sure. Yep.
for you.
I
But
will
in the
agree with you.
meantime, I do work, like we have with my company, we do consulting engagements where we're training the whole organization. Personally, I work one-on-one as well, and I love
Nice.
working one-on-one with leaders. So
Awesome.
through coaching
Cool.
capacity,
Thank you.
and And I'm also happy to just come and chat for an hour.